You can take about $5 worth of Costco top sirloin, cook it in an ordinary kitchen, and put a plate on the table that eats like something a steakhouse would charge you well over $100 for. I am not talking about pouring sauce over bad meat or hiding it under butter. I am talking about taking an honest, inexpensive working cut and treating it the way a butcher treats meat when he wants tenderness, crust, and flavor without paying ribeye money. The trick is not one magic ingredient. It is a sequence. And if you skip the wrong step, the whole thing falls apart. My name is Marcus, and I spent enough years around butcher blocks to learn that expensive beef forgives mistakes, and cheap beef exposes them. That is why most people think the price is the difference. It is not. Technique is the difference more often than anyone behind a glass case is going to stop and explain. And today I am going to show you the exact steak I look for, what I do to it before the pan ever gets hot, the one mistake that turns a good sirloin chewy, and the finish that makes people at the table swear you bought something far more expensive. Stay with me, because the most important step happens before the steak ever sees heat, and almost everybody rushes right past it. And one more thing before I show you the cut. Do not confuse this with pretending cheap beef becomes a different animal. A sirloin will never grow ribeye marbling because I touched it with salt and heat. What I can do is remove the mistakes that make sirloin seem cheaper than it really is, then add back the crust, moisture, seasoning, and richness people associate with a much more expensive plate. That is an honest promise, and it is a better one than a magic trick. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel if you want more of the butcher counter knowledge that used to get passed from one working man to another and somehow stopped getting passed along. I am not here to make cheap meat sound magical. I am here to show you where the value is, why it works, and how to cook it without wasting your money. If that saves you one bad steak or one overpriced dinner, the subscription has already paid for itself. Now let me take you to the Costco case. I want top sirloin, preferably a thick center-cut piece with a clean shape and visible flecks of intramuscular fat. Prices move by store and week, so focus on value, not one exact label. I do not want a paper-thin piece, a heavy seam of gristle through the middle, or something cut wildly uneven. A cheap steak still has to be a good cheap steak. Saving money is not buying whatever costs least. It is knowing which inexpensive cut gives technique something to work with. Top sirloin comes from a part of the animal that actually had a job. It moved. It carried weight. Its fibers are firmer than the lazy muscles running along the back, where ribeye and strip come from. That does not make sirloin bad meat. It means you have to cook with those fibers instead of pretending they are not there. If ribeye is naturally tender because the muscle did very little work, sirloin is the honest working man of the case. Give it the right treatment, and it will reward you. Treat it like a ribeye from start to finish, and it will remind you exactly what you paid. The first thing I do is salt it early, not 5 minutes before cooking, not while the pan heats. I salt the steak the night before, about 3/4 of a teaspoon of kosher salt per pound, and set it uncovered on a rack in the refrigerator. This does 2 jobs while you sleep. At first, the salt pulls moisture to the surface. Then that moisture dissolves the salt and begins moving back into the meat. At the same time, the cold refrigerator air dries the exterior. That dry surface matters because browning cannot properly begin while water is sitting there stealing heat. Wet meat steams. Dry meat browns. That is not chef talk. That is physics. And it is one of the cheapest upgrades you can make to any steak. Then I look at the grain before I cook anything. Do this while the steak is raw, because it is easier to see. Find the direction those muscle fibers run and remember it. Later, when the steak is cooked, you are going to slice across those fibers, not along them. This matters more on sirloin than it does on a tenderloin. Long fibers make your teeth do the work. Cutting across them makes your knife do the work first. Now we come to the part that changes the whole cook. I do not start with violence. I start gently. Set your oven to 225 or 250 degrees Fahrenheit and put the steak on a wire rack over a sheet pan. If you are using a grill, build 2 zones and keep the steak on the cool side with the lid down. We are warming the meat slowly and evenly, not building crust yet. Put a thermometer in the thickest part and let the center climb to about 105 to 110 degrees if you want medium rare when everything is finished. Do not guess. A cheap thermometer costs less than ruining one good piece of meat, and the thermometer does not care how confident you feel. This slow stage is where a $5 steak begins separating itself from the way most $5 steaks are cooked. When you throw cold sirloin straight into a blazing pan and leave it there until the middle is done, the exterior spends too long under punishing heat. You get a dark crust, then a thick gray band, and only a small pink center. Gentle heat shrinks that gray band. The inside comes up together, almost edge to edge, and because the final sear will be short, the muscle never gets the chance to tighten into a dry knot. When the steak hits 105 to 110, take it out and leave it on the rack while you heat a heavy cast iron pan. This pause is useful. The surface dries again while the pan gets properly hot. And I mean properly hot, not 2 minutes because you got impatient. Give cast iron 6 or 7 minutes. A heavy pan works because it holds heat when cold meat lands in it. A thin pan loses that heat instantly, and the steak starts steaming just when you need the surface to brown. Right before the steak goes in, press every side with a paper towel. Be serious about it. Top, bottom, edges, all of it. If you see moisture, remove it. Then add a spoonful of beef tallow. If you trim beef at home, render the hard fat slowly and keep the jar in the refrigerator. If you do not have tallows, use a high-heat neutral fat. But beef fat is my choice because you are building beef flavor with beef flavor. And now the part that looks dramatic but lasts almost no time, the sear. 45 seconds on the first face, flip it. 45 seconds on the second. Do not slide it around. Do not lift a corner every 10 seconds. Let contact do the work. But the real steakhouse finish is still coming, and this is where cheap sirloin can fool somebody if you do it correctly. Sirloin does not carry the internal fat that a heavily marbled ribeye carries, so you have to give the outside some of the richness the muscle did not bring with it. In the final 30 seconds, lower the heat just a touch. Add a crushed garlic clove and a small knob of butter to the tallow. Tilt the pan and spoon that foaming fat over the steak again and again. You are not trying to turn butter into a sauce. You are building aroma and coating that crust with hot fat at the exact moment the steak is finishing. This is the point where the kitchen starts smelling expensive, and smell matters more to the way people experience dinner than most cooks realize. When the steak comes out of the pan, do not bury it under foil. You just spent all that time building a dry crust, and foil traps steam against it. Set it on a board for 3 or 4 minutes while you finish the plate. Because we brought the center up gently before the sear, it does not need a long traditional rest. Grind black pepper over it now. Scorched pepper turns bitter, so I save it for after the hard heat. Then find the grain you looked at earlier. Turn the steak so your knife crosses those fibers and cut thin slices on a slight angle. A piece that would feel firm cut with the grain suddenly eats tender because your knife has already shortened the fibers for the person chewing it. And this is where we turn a good steak into a steakhouse dinner instead of merely a steak on a plate. A $120 dinner is never just beef. Restaurants understand heat, salt, fat, contrast, and presentation. While the steak rests, pour off most of the pan fat, but leave the brown bits. Put the cast iron over medium heat, add a splash of beef stock or water, and scrape those browned bits loose. Add a teaspoon of Dijon mustard and a little Worcestershire sauce, then reduce until the liquid lightly coats a spoon. Turn off the heat and swirl in a small piece of cold butter. That butter emulsifies the sauce and gives you the glossy finish people associate with an expensive plate. Do not drown the meat. That is another common mistake. A good steakhouse does not serve a swimming pool with beef in the middle, spoon a narrow line of sauce onto the plate or under the slices, then lay the sirloin across it so the crust stays exposed. Sprinkle a little flaky salt across the cut surface if you have it. The salt lands directly where your tongue will touch the meat, so you need very little. If you want the full dinner, put roasted potatoes or a simple green vegetable beside it. Nothing complicated. The point is that the steak remains the center of the plate, while the sides make the whole thing feel complete. Now let me explain why this combination works, because the trick is not the sauce. The trick is controlling every place where inexpensive steak usually loses. Sirloin loses first on tenderness, so we cook it gently and cut across the grain. It loses on internal fat, so we finish with tallow and butter instead of asking the lean muscle to baste itself. It loses on crust when people put wet meat into a lukewarm pan, so we dry it twice and use heavy iron. It loses on seasoning when salt sits only on the outside, so we give the salt a night to work. None of those steps changes the name of the cut. They simply stop the cut from being punished for not being ribeye. That is why I do not like the phrase cheap meat. There is inexpensive meat, and there is badly handled meat. Price gives you a head start, but it never guarantees the finish line. There is one more mistake I want you to avoid, especially if you are cooking for company. Do not choose a thin sirloin because each person wants his own steak. Buy one thick piece and share it. Thickness gives you control. A steak 1.5 inches thick gives you enough distance between crust and center to create two different environments at once: aggressive browning outside and gentle pink meat inside. A 1/2-inch steak gives you almost no room. By the time the outside looks right, the middle is already gone. One large steak sliced across a board also looks more impressive at the table than 4 thin gray pieces sitting by themselves. That is one of those rare cases where the cheaper approach can actually look more expensive. Let me tell you about a customer I had years ago. Every other Friday he bought 2 ribeyes for himself and his wife. Then the price jumped, and one week I watched him hold the package longer than usual, doing the arithmetic in his head. I handed him a thick top sirloin and told him to salt it overnight, cook it slow, finish it hard, and slice it thin. The next Friday he came back looking irritated. Then he said, "Why did you let me buy ribeyes all those years?" That is the kind of complaint a butcher enjoys hearing. The answer, of course, is that ribeye is wonderful. I am not going to insult a great cut to make a cheap one sound better. Ribeye gives you tenderness and fat with less work. That is what the premium buys. But if you know how to handle a working muscle, the distance between a $6 sirloin and a luxury dinner becomes far smaller than the menu price would have you believe. That is the real trick. Not alchemy, not a secret powder. Knowledge closing a gap that money usually closes for you. Now look at the arithmetic. Suppose your portion of sirloin costs about $5. Add salt, a little tallow or cooking fat, garlic, butter, a spoon of mustard, and a splash of stock. Even if I am generous, you are still nowhere near the cost of an upscale steakhouse entree, much less the entire night after tax, tip, drinks, parking, and sides. The restaurant's $120 experience includes labor, rent, service, equipment, and atmosphere. I am not pretending those things cost nothing. I am saying the part sitting on your fork can be much closer than most people realize, and the difference is often a handful of techniques that cost almost nothing. That distinction matters because I have watched people pick up beef, study the price, put it back, and walk away. What bothers me is when they think only the expensive cuts are worth cooking. They are not. The old butcher counter taught people how to make the rest of the animal eat well, and much of that conversation disappeared with it. That knowledge still matters today. So here is your homework. Next time you are at Costco, do not head straight for the ribeye because the word feels safe. Look at the top sirloin. Find a thick, even piece with visible marbling and no ugly seam running through the center. Take it home, salt it overnight uncovered, cook it gently to 105 or 110. Dry it again. Sear it in a properly heated cast iron pan with tallow. Finish with garlic and butter. Pepper after, slice across the grain. Make the quick pan sauce if you want the full steakhouse plate. Then put it in front of somebody without telling them what you paid. And when they take the first bite, do not ask, "Is it good?" Watch their face. That will tell you more than the answer. If they ask what cut it is, you did your job. If they guess ribeye, smile and let them finish dinner before you show them the Costco label. Tell me in the comments what Costco is charging for top sirloin where you live, and tell me which inexpensive cut you want Marcus to break down next. I want to know what people are actually seeing in their meat cases, because prices and cuts change from one part of the country to another. And if somebody older taught you a trick for making a cheap cut eat better, put that down there too. Those are the pieces of knowledge worth keeping alive. And if this saved you money, subscribe, because the next lesson goes one step further. I am going to show you the cut sitting near the expensive steaks that many shoppers mistake for ordinary chuck, even though one section can eat astonishingly close to ribeye for a fraction of the price. There is one visual clue on the meat that tells you whether you found the good end or the wrong end, and once you see it, you will never look at that case the same way again. Until then, buy with your eyes, cook with patience, and remember this. The price tag tells you what the store wants for the meat. It does not tell you what a skilled pair of hands can turn it into.